Mrs. Evelyn Carter, an 82-year-old retired schoolteacher, walked into Westbrook National Bank on a bright Monday morning. Dressed in a modest brown coat with a pearl brooch, she carried a small leather handbag containing her bank book and identification. She had been a loyal customer of this bank for over 40 years, yet today something felt off. As she stepped up to the counter, a young teller named Rachel barely acknowledged her presence. Instead of the usual warm greeting, Rachel sighed impatiently. "Yes, what do you need?" she asked, her tone sharp. Mrs. Carter smiled politely. "I'd like to withdraw some money from my account, dear." Rachel glanced at her, then looked past her as if she weren't worth her time. "Do you have ID?" "Yes, of course." Mrs. Carter opened her purse and handed over her driver's license and bank card. Rachel took the ID but frowned. "Are you sure this is yours?" Mrs. Carter blinked, confused. "Excuse me?" Rachel exhaled loudly. "We've had some issues with fraud lately. I need to verify some things." Mrs. Carter's heart sank. She had been banking here for decades. "Dear, I've been a customer here since before you were born. I just need to make a withdrawal." But Rachel wasn't listening. Instead, she waved over the bank manager, a stiff-looking man in a navy blue suit. "This woman is trying to make a large withdrawal. I think we need to double-check her information." Carter's stomach twisted. She wasn't asking for much, just a few $100s for groceries and bills. Why was she being treated like a criminal? As she opened her mouth to protest, a deep, unmistakable voice cut through the tension. "Is there a problem here?" Heads turned. There, standing by the entrance, was none other than Vin Diesel. The entire bank seemed to pause as Vin Diesel strode forward. Dressed in a fitted black t-shirt and jeans, his signature bald head gleamed under the bright bank lights. His presence commanded attention, and whispers quickly spread among the customers and staff. Rachel, the teller, looked stunned. The bank manager straightened his tie, suddenly aware that they were being watched. Mrs. Carter, still holding her purse tightly, turned to look at the unexpected visitor. Vin Diesel's deep voice rumbled again. "I asked, what's the problem here?" The bank manager cleared his throat. Sir, this is a private matter." Vin crossed his arms. "Looks to me like you're giving this lady a hard time." "Why?" Rachel shifted uncomfortably. "We're just following protocol. We have to verify large withdrawals, especially when there are concerns about fraud." Mrs. Carter shook her head. "I've been coming here for years. My account is in perfect standing. I don't see why I'm being questioned." Vin's eyes darkened. He had seen this before. People in power using vague policies to justify discrimination. He turned to Mrs. Carter. "Ma'am, do you mind if I stay here with you?" She hesitated, but then nodded. "I'd appreciate that, young man." Rachel glanced nervously at the bank manager, but he gave her a slight nod, signaling her to continue. "Fine. We just need to run some additional checks." Vin chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "Funny, I just withdrew cash from this bank yesterday without a problem. Didn't see anyone questioning me." Rachel turned red. She had no excuse for that. Mrs. Carter felt a spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this situation wouldn't end the way they wanted it to. As the confrontation continued, more customers in the bank started to pay attention. Some whispered among themselves, recognizing Vin Diesel immediately. Others frowned at the way Mrs. Carter was being treated. A young man near the back of the line pulled out his phone and began recording. "This is ridiculous," he muttered. "They're treating her like a criminal for no reason." Vin Diesel noticed the growing attention but kept his focus on Mrs. Carter. He turned back to Rachel. "So what exactly do you need to verify?" Rachel hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the scrutiny. We just need to confirm the source of funds and ensure the account is not compromised." Mrs. Carter scoffed. "I am the account holder. My name is on the account, my ID is valid, and I have been banking here for years." The bank manager stepped forward, his face tense. "Sir, we appreciate your concern, but we have our policies." Vin Diesel tilted his head. "Policies that seem to apply only when it's convenient." A middle-aged woman in line spoke up. "He's right. I withdrew money last week, no questions asked." Another man chimed in. "Same here. This feels wrong." The bank manager's expression shifted. The last thing he wanted was a public spectacle, especially with cameras recording. Vin Diesel turned to Mrs. Carter. "Ma'am, you don't have to deal with this alone. If they don't resolve this, I can make some calls." Mrs. Carter gave a small, grateful nod. For the first time, she felt like someone was truly on her side. Rachel glanced at the manager again, unsure what to do. The pressure was building, and soon something had to give. The bank manager wiped his forehead, feeling the weight of the situation. He had dealt with difficult customers before, but this was different. A celebrity was involved, cameras were rolling, and the crowd was clearly siding with Mrs. Carter. Rachel looked at the manager, silently pleading for guidance. She hadn't expected the situation to spiral this far. "Sir, should I proceed with the withdrawal?" she asked hesitantly. The manager hesitated. If he allowed the transaction now, it would look like he had been wrong all along. But if he continued to stall, the backlash could be even worse. Vin Diesel crossed his arms, his deep voice cutting through the tension. "Let me make this simple. Mrs. Carter is a loyal customer. She has her ID, her account information, and her withdrawal slip. Either you do your job, or we take this to the bank's corporate office." Rachel swallowed hard. The customers around them murmured in agreement. A young woman near the front shook her head. This is exactly why people don't trust banks. They pick and choose who they respect. The manager shifted uncomfortably. His reputation was on the line. The bank's reputation was on the line. He needed to find a way out, fast. He forced a smile and turned to Mrs. Carter. "Ma'am, I sincerely apologize for the delay. There must have been some miscommunication. Rachel, go ahead and process her withdrawal." But Mrs. Carter wasn't ready to let it go. She raised an eyebrow. "Miscommunication? That's what you're calling it?" The crowd murmured again, sensing her frustration. Even Vin Diesel narrowed his eyes. He had seen too many situations like this before. This wasn't a mistake, it was discrimination. And it wasn't over yet. Mrs. Carter didn't move. She wasn't about to let them brush this off as a simple miscommunication. For years she had dealt with subtle discrimination, forced to smile and walk away. But not today. She folded her arms and looked directly at the manager. "You think an apology is enough? Do you know how humiliating it is to be treated like a criminal just for wanting to withdraw my own money?" The bank manager shifted uncomfortably. "Mrs. Carter, I assure you—" "No," she interrupted firmly. "You don't assure me of anything. You allowed your teller to disrespect me. You let her assume I was some kind of fraud just because I'm an old black woman." Rachel, the teller, lowered her eyes. She knew she was in the wrong, but she had no words to fix it. Vin Diesel nodded in agreement. "This isn't just about one withdrawal. It's about how you treat people. You're not doing Mrs. Carter a favor by letting her take out her own money. You're doing what you should have done from the start." The crowd started clapping, voices rising in support. "That's right," one man shouted. "How many other people has this happened to?" Mrs. Carter leaned in. "And let me ask you this. If I hadn't spoken up, if Mr. Diesel hadn't been here, would you have let me walk out of here empty-handed?" The manager's face reddened. He had no good answer. Before he could respond, a young bank employee stepped forward. "Mrs. Carter, I'd like to personally process your withdrawal, and I think our manager has something else to say." All eyes turned back to him. The pressure was unbearable. With a deep breath, he looked at Mrs. Carter and finally admitted, "You're right, and I need to make this right." But was he sincere or just trying to save himself? The bank manager swallowed hard, feeling the weight of dozens of eyes on him. He knew there was no way out of this without addressing the issue head-on. He turned to Mrs. Carter, forcing a weak smile. "You're absolutely right, Mrs. Carter," he admitted. "What happened here today was unacceptable, and for that, I sincerely apologize." The crowd remained silent, waiting to see if his words carried any real meaning. Mrs. Carter narrowed her eyes. "An apology is a start, but it's not enough," she said. "This isn't just about me. How many others have been treated like this? How many walked away humiliated, never speaking up?" Vin Diesel stepped forward. "Exactly. A public apology is meaningless unless you take real action. What are you going to do to make sure this never happens again?" The manager hesitated. He hadn't expected to be called out so directly, especially by a celebrity. He cleared his throat. "I will personally ensure that our staff undergoes sensitivity and anti-discrimination training. And as a gesture of goodwill, Mrs. Carter, I'd like to waive any fees on your account for the next year." A murmur spread through the crowd. Some nodded in approval, but Mrs. Carter wasn't easily impressed. I don't need your handouts, she said firmly. I need fairness. I need to know that the next elderly black woman who walks in here won't be treated like a thief. The young employee who had stepped up earlier spoke again. We should also review our policies to make sure no one else experiences what Mrs. Carter did. The manager nodded, realizing he had no choice. I'll set up a meeting with our corporate office immediately. Vin Diesel crossed his arms. Good, because trust me, this isn't something that can just be swept under the rug. The crowd erupted into applause. Mrs. Carter's voice had been heard, but was this enough? Would the bank truly change, or was this just another empty promise? The crowd slowly began to disperse, but the impact of what had just happened lingered in the air. Mrs. Carter adjusted her coat, her face still holding the frustration of being treated unfairly. Vin Diesel, standing beside her, could see the exhaustion in her eyes. This isn't over, he said, his voice calm but firm. Public apologies are easy. Real change takes work. Mrs. Carter nodded. Exactly. I've seen too many apologies that lead to nothing. This needs to mean something. A few people in the crowd pulled out their phones, still recording, still talking about what had happened. A woman approached Mrs. Carter and gently touched her arm. You spoke up for all of us today, she said. Thank you. Another customer chimed in. We should report this to corporate. If we all complain, they'll have no choice but to listen. Vin Diesel grinned. Now that's an idea. Public pressure works. If they don't fix this, we make sure the world knows. The young employee who had defended Mrs. Carter earlier nodded eagerly. I'll send a report from inside, but it would help if others did too. The more voices, the better. Mrs. Carter straightened up, her strength returning. Then let's do it. I'm not just fighting for myself. I'm fighting for everyone who has ever been made to feel less than. Vin patted her shoulder. That's what real power looks like. The group exchanged numbers, agreeing to file formal complaints and spread the story. This wasn't just about one incident. It was about making sure no one else had to go through it again. As Mrs. Carter and Vin Diesel walked out of the bank, she felt something she hadn't in a long time. Hope. Hope that this time, things might actually change. The next morning, Mrs. Carter woke up to her phone buzzing nonstop. Her grandson, Malik, had sent her multiple messages. Grandma, you're all over the internet. The video is everywhere. Still groggy, Mrs. Carter put on her glasses and clicked the link he sent. To her surprise, the video of Vin Diesel standing up for her had gone viral. News outlets, influencers, and even celebrities were sharing it. People were outraged at how she had been treated. Meanwhile, at the bank's corporate office, the executives were in full-blown panic mode. Their social media pages were flooded with angry comments, hashtags demanding justice were trending, and their customer service lines were overwhelmed. The branch manager, Mr. Holloway, received a call from the corporate office. What the hell happened at your branch yesterday? We're getting thousands of complaints. Mr. Holloway stammered, it was a misunderstanding. Misunderstanding? The executive's voice was cold. A Hollywood celebrity was involved. We're on every news channel. Fix this immediately. Back at Mrs. Carter's house, she sat at her kitchen table with a cup of tea, watching a news anchor discuss her situation. Vin Diesel had made a statement on social media. This isn't just about one bank or one woman. It's about how we treat people. We can do better. Just then, her phone rang. It was an unknown number. Hello, she answered. Mrs. Carter, this is Julia Grant, the VP of Public Relations from the bank. We'd like to issue a formal apology, and we'd love to speak with you personally. Mrs. Carter smiled knowingly. They weren't calling out of kindness. They were calling because they had no choice. She took a sip of her tea. Well then, let's talk. Later that afternoon, Mrs. Carter arrived at the bank's headquarters, accompanied by Malik. The media was already outside, cameras flashing as she stepped out of the car. Reporters shouted questions, but she simply smiled and walked in with confidence. Inside, Julia Grant, the VP of Public Relations, greeted her nervously. Mrs. Carter, thank you for coming. We deeply regret what happened to you. It does not reflect our values. Mrs. Carter raised an eyebrow. Oh, so your employees just act like this on their own? Julia hesitated. We take full responsibility. That's why we'd like to make things right. We're issuing a public apology, retraining our staff, and offering you compensation for your experience. Malik crossed his arms. You mean you're doing damage control because Vin Diesel put you on blast? Julia's face turned red. We truly want to improve. Just then, the CEO of the bank walked in. Mrs. Carter, I'm deeply sorry, he said, extending his hand. We've terminated the employees involved, and we'd like to make a donation in your name to a charity of your choice. Mrs. Carter looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. That's a start, but it won't change unless you address the real issue, how you treat people like me, even when the cameras aren't rolling. The CEO swallowed hard. We'll do better. Outside, a press conference was set up. The CEO and Julia stood beside Mrs. Carter as they issued their public apology. But Mrs. Carter knew words weren't enough. Change had to happen. As she left the building, a familiar black SUV pulled up. The window rolled down, and there was Vin Diesel smiling. How'd it go? He asked. Mrs. Carter chuckled. Oh, they apologized all right, but we'll see if they mean it. Vin grinned. Something tells me they'll think twice before disrespecting another elder again. By the time Mrs. Carter returned home, the internet had already exploded with reactions to the incident. Hashtags like Justice for Mrs. Carter and Vin Diesel Hero were trending worldwide. Social media was flooded with video clips of the bank scene, showing how the tellers mistreated her and how Vin Diesel had stepped in. News outlets picked up the story, and talk shows debated the issue of discrimination in banking. Prominent figures, including activists and celebrities, voiced their opinions. Some even shared their own experiences of being mistreated at financial institutions. Mrs. Carter's phone wouldn't stop ringing. Her friends and family called to check on her. Even her pastor, Reverend Lewis, called. Sister Carter, you have the whole country talking, he said with a chuckle. I didn't ask for all this attention, Pastor. She sighed. But maybe it was meant to happen, he replied. Maybe God put you in that bank at that moment for a reason. Meanwhile, Vin Diesel took to Instagram. He posted a picture of himself with Mrs. Carter, smiling outside the bank. The caption read, Respect our elders. Everyone deserves dignity. Let's be better. Justice for Mrs. Carter. His post received millions of likes and thousands of supportive comments. On the other side, the bank was facing serious backlash. Customers threatened to close their accounts, and a petition demanding real policy changes gained over 100,000 signatures overnight. Mrs. Carter shook her head as she watched the news. She never expected her simple trip to the bank to turn into a national conversation. But maybe, just maybe, it would lead to something bigger than she ever imagined. The next morning, the bank found itself in full damage control mode. The public outrage was growing, and customers were withdrawing their money in protest. News stations ran segments discussing racial discrimination in banking, using Mrs. Carter's case as a prime example. In response, the bank's CEO, Richard Dawson, released a public statement. We deeply regret the unfortunate incident that took place at our branch. Discrimination of any kind goes against our company's values. We are conducting an internal review and taking appropriate action. But the statement only made things worse. People saw it as a generic corporate apology, lacking sincerity and accountability. The internet demanded real action. Meanwhile, Mrs. Carter received an unexpected phone call from a bank executive. Mrs. Carter, we'd love for you to come in and speak with us, the voice said. I have nothing to say to you, she replied firmly. Please, we'd like to make this right, the executive pleaded. Just as she was about to decline again, Vin Diesel, who had been sitting across from her at her dining table, gestured for the phone. She hesitated, then put it on speaker. If you really want to make this right, Vin said, his voice calm but firm, it's going to take more than a meeting. Your policies need to change. Your staff needs real training. And Mrs. Carter deserves an apology, not in private, but in public. There was silence on the other end. We'll see what we can do, the executive finally responded. You do that, Vin said, ending the call. Mrs. Carter looked at him, her eyes filled with gratitude. This isn't over yet, Vin said. But trust me, we're going to make sure they learn their lesson. The bank's weak response only fueled the fire. Social media exploded with hashtags like Justice for Mrs. Carter and Boycott the Bank. People were calling for action, not just apologies. News outlets invited activists and financial experts to discuss racial discrimination in the banking industry, turning Mrs. Carter's experience into a national debate. Meanwhile, Vin Diesel wasn't done yet. He reached out to his legal team, ensuring Mrs. Carter had the best representation possible. His lawyer, a sharp-witted attorney named Lisa Morales, was eager to take the case. "This isn't just about Mrs. Carter," Lisa told Vin over a video call. "This is about every elderly black customer who has been humiliated, ignored, or denied fair treatment. We need to hit them where it hurts. And that's their money," Vin said, nodding. Mrs. Carter, however, was hesitant. "I'm not sure I want to go through all this. I just wanted to withdraw my money in peace." Lisa smiled warmly. "I understand, Mrs. Carter, but what happened to you was wrong, and they need to be held accountable. We'll take care of everything. You just have to decide if you want to stand up and make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." Mrs. Carter looked at Vin, who gave her an encouraging nod. After a long pause, she took a deep breath and said, "All right, let's do it." With that, the fight escalated. The bank tried to make private settlement offers, but Mrs. Carter and Vin refused to let them brush this under the rug. This wasn't just about one woman anymore. It was about justice, and the world was watching. As the legal battle gained momentum, the bank found itself in a public relations nightmare. Customers started closing their accounts in protest, and major news networks continued covering the story. The CEO of the bank, Richard Langley, called for an emergency meeting with his board of directors. "We are hemorrhaging money and trust," Langley said, slamming his hand on the table. "We need to fix this, now." One of the board members hesitated before speaking. "What if we issue another public apology and offer Mrs. Carter a generous settlement?" Another scoffed. "That won't be enough. Not after Vin Diesel got involved. The world is watching, and people don't just want apologies anymore. They want accountability." Realizing they had no choice, the bank's legal team reached out to Lisa Morales. "We'd like to discuss a settlement," the lead attorney said cautiously. Lisa wasn't impressed. "This isn't just about money. Mrs. Carter deserves a full public acknowledgement of wrongdoing, policy changes to prevent this from happening again, and disciplinary action against the employees involved." The bank's lawyer hesitated. "That might be difficult." Lisa cut him off. "Then we'll see you in court." At the same time, outside the bank, protesters gathered, demanding justice. Signs reading, "Respect our elders," and "End banking discrimination," filled the streets. News reporters captured every moment, and Vin Diesel made a surprise appearance, standing in solidarity with Mrs. Carter and the protesters. The pressure was mounting, and the bank knew it. Their reputation and billions of dollars were at stake. The question was, would they do the right thing, or would they let greed and pride destroy them? As the trial date loomed closer, the bank's executives grew increasingly desperate. The negative press had caused a significant drop in their stock value, and customers continued to withdraw their funds in protest. The pressure was unbearable. The CEO, Richard Langley, sat in his office, staring at the latest financial reports. "If we don't contain this disaster, we could be looking at irreversible damage," he muttered to his advisors. One of his top lawyers, Daniel Pierce, leaned forward. "We need to make Mrs. Carter and her legal team an offer they can't refuse. A settlement that ends this before it goes to trial." Langley exhaled sharply. "How much?" $10 million. The room went silent. It was an outrageous sum, but considering the bank's potential losses if the trial went public, it was a necessary sacrifice. Shortly after, Lisa Morales received the call. She and Mrs. Carter sat in the attorney's office as the bank's representative laid out the deal. "We're willing to settle for $10 million, a formal apology, and immediate policy changes regarding customer treatment." Mrs. Carter, shocked, turned to Lisa. "That's a lot of money," she whispered. Lisa folded her arms. "Money is nice, but will they also fire the employees who humiliated you? Will they hold the manager accountable?" The bank's lawyer hesitated. "We can discuss that." Lisa shook her head. "No discussion. Either they take full accountability or we expose everything in court." Mrs. Carter thought for a moment, looking at the protesters outside. "I don't just want justice for me. I want to make sure this never happens to anyone else." The bank's representative sighed. "I'll take your demands to the board." As the deal hung in the balance, the world watched, waiting to see if justice would truly be served. The next morning, the entire nation held its breath as Mrs. Carter and her legal team arrived at the courthouse. Journalists, activists, and supporters flooded the steps, eager to see how this fight for justice would conclude. The bank's representatives sat on the other side of the room, their expressions tense. Just before the judge entered, Richard Langley, the bank's CEO, leaned toward Lisa Morales. "We accept your terms," he said, his voice resigned. Lisa didn't react immediately. "That means the employees involved will be fired, the manager will be permanently banned from working in banking, and the institution will implement new anti-discrimination policies?" Langley nodded. "Yes, and Mrs. Carter will receive the full settlement." A murmur ran through the courtroom as Lisa stood and whispered the news to Mrs. Carter. The elderly woman's eyes welled with tears, not because of the money, but because of what this meant for people like her in the future. Vin Diesel, who had been quietly sitting in the back of the courtroom, finally stepped forward. "Mrs. Carter, you stood your ground when they tried to humiliate you. You didn't let them win. You're a hero to so many people today." The judge officially recorded the settlement, bringing the case to a close. The courtroom erupted in cheers as Mrs. Carter stepped outside, greeted by a crowd of supporters chanting her name. "I didn't do this for money," she told the cameras. "I did it for every person who has ever been made to feel less than because of who they are." As Vin Diesel escorted her down the courthouse steps, she smiled. "Now, young man, you still owe me lunch." Vin laughed. "Anywhere you want, Mrs. Carter." And with that, justice had been served, not just for her, but for everyone watching. This story is a powerful reminder that no one should be mistreated because of their age, race, or background. If you believe in standing up against injustice, share this story with your friends and family. Let's raise awareness and ensure that respect and dignity are given to all. Have you ever witnessed or experienced discrimination? Tell us in the comments below. We'd love to hear your thoughts. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more inspiring stories.